Hello and welcome back, adventurers. It is time for us to wrap up and complete the ranking of the Runesmith runes. And that means ranking all of the diacritic runes. That's all we have left. In order to do that, though, we have to talk a little bit about how diacritic runes work. So these are etched or traced onto a base rune. So you never directly put a diacritic rune like onto a creature or something, they always go onto a certain rune. When the base rune is lost or invoked, the diacritic rune is also lost or invoked. A rune with a diacritic rune on it counts as having one rune to invoke. So you don't have to invoke the diacritic rune separate from the base rune, you invoke the base rune. Etching diacritic runes does count against the number you can have etched. So if you etch a rune and then a diacritic rune on top of that, that is two etchings done. Finally, a base rune can only have one diacritic rune on it at a given time. So you can't just load up a rune with like 5 diacritic runes. And those are your basics for diacritics. The diacritic runes become available at level 5 and then another set at level 13. All the level 5 diacritic runes affect the invocation of the base rune, while the level 13 diacritic runes can have an effect to the passive and invocation aspects of their base runes. I will still be using the same criteria that I've been using, but with a few tweaks. So let's walk through it really quickly. S, this is a rune that feels strong when it becomes available and remains strong for the character's lifespan. It should be worth etching as well as tracing. It should also have an effect that is very impactful on whatever aspect of the base rune it does affect. You should struggle to not use it when it would be applicable, and it should apply to the runes you find to be your best. It should be so good that not having it feels like a mistake. A is for runes that, again, you will likely keep throughout, like keep using throughout, but could fall off at higher levels of play. Maybe you wouldn't use them as often. It should apply to the runes that you feel have the most impact and should improve the impact of at least part of that rune in a significant way. It just may not always be worth etching, but it should absolutely be worth tracing regularly. B is for runes that you would likely etch onto other runes, but there are reasons you would trace it that will come up, often enough. It should have either like kind of a general use that isn't as potent as those in A, or be more niche but critical when it fits the application. C is for a rune that will always be niche in application, or a general rune that just isn't significant enough to trace or etch in almost any situation, but it doesn't hurt you. You could make it work, but there's other choices that usually get the job done better. And D, this is, well, it's for a diacritic rune that really never improves the base rune in any real way, or potentially even makes it worse somehow, or tracing it might just be a complete waste of actions. And therefore, you shouldn't take it. With all that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into our level 5 diacritic runes. And that starts us off with Av, diacritic rune of succession. Keep in mind you're making like words with this, so whatever you might have for the base rune, it'd be Av, whatever that is. Use this by putting it on a rune, which means it's very non-specific. The effect is when the base rune is invoked, you can invoke a rune on a different rune bearer within 15 feet of this rune bearer as a free action. This helps you just get more invokes in a single action. And you can only have one instance of this active at a time, and once you invoke it, you cannot trace it or etch it again for 10 minutes. We'll see that come up several times. This feels like the kind of rune that you should etch, but probably never trace, right? Keep in mind that by default, when you invoke, you can invoke up to 2 runes within 30 feet with a single action. This potentially allows you to invoke, beyond that 30 feet distance limit, because 15 of that 30 feet gives you the 45, or just allows you to for a third invocation for the one action. But if you take an action or actions to trace this, then you're kind of wasting actions. It doesn't trace well, is kind of what I'm getting at. Not impossible to get value out of tracing it, but very, very niche to get value out of the trace itself. So, okay. It is possible though that you might, use this with a strike to trace for one act for, one action where you strike and trace all at once, and then it's less costly, but fine. And yes, triggering a rune further away is nice, but I don't know. I would never apply this assuming that this scenario is going to come up as the goal. Triggering through it once isn't a bad thing, but keep in mind, instead of this, you could have a different diacritic rune etched, or you just have a different rune etched altogether that's more valuable. So I'm struggling to see how having this etched is of higher value than simply etching something that is just more value on its own, right? This is only good if you want to get that third triggering all at once, and I just don't know that it's worth it for that when you're giving up the etching you could do that's more potent for the team. So unfortunately, I'm going to start off with a C. Not that there's no use case, I just don't think it's strong enough. Then we have N, Diacritic Rune of Expansion. This is on a rune that deals damage. This is on a rune that you're tracing, right? Keep in mind, so you're also tracing this. When the base rune is invoked, each creature in a 15-foot emanation, including the rune bearer, is affected by it, making saving throws as necessary. Any single creature can only be affected by this invocation of the rune once. So no somehow, hitting the same creature multiple times with the invocation. So here we are finally filling a hole that the class has. Not that it completely has this hole, right? But there aren't a whole lot of things that let you do AoE damage. This is a solid way to add AoE damage to any damage rune. And there's quite a bit of value in that, right? By this level, you're level 5, which means that if you're using, say, the fire or which one is not the electricity, but the acid rune, you're dealing 3d8 damage when you invoke it. Well, 3d8 damage on its own is not amazing at this level. But if you're hitting, say, 3 enemies, because it's got this diacritic rune on it, and you're spreading that damage out, that's going to feel a lot better. The question is, can you set this up to only hurt enemies? And if so, how many? This is one of those effects that probably isn't worth it if you get only one additional enemy, so you'll need to make sure that you're getting more than that if you can when you're using it. Then it loses value if it hits allies a little bit, but not necessarily, right? We're talking about AoEs. We see a lot of spells that do AoE damage, and if it's just damage, sometimes it's fine to have an ally in there if you're hitting a lot of enemies. So it might be that you've got 3 enemies stacked up around one ally, and hitting them as well, as long as you're hitting all 3 enemies, might absolutely be worth it. But again, the big thing for me here is that you're filling a gap in the class. And that gap is that they struggle with AoE damage. Again, not entirely, but largely. And this helps deal with that. Now, we do have later on at higher levels runes that deal damage in AoEs. So those kind of exist. This just helps with early ones. This can be used with later ones, keep in mind, because you are spreading that invocation to multiple directions, multiple creatures. There's certainly ways to use that are really interesting. And you could really lay down some big AoE with some of the other AoE damage ones that then spread to other creatures and trigger those as well and larger AoEs. Anyway, there's potential things that are very interesting with it. I think because it's filling in those gaps, yes, there's downside. You're going to hit allies with it. Probably okay because it's just damage. I'm going to go with an A on this. Maybe I'm giving it too much value, but I hate that the class really lacks AoE without it. That brings us to Fob, Diacritic Rune of Doubling. You're going to put this on a rune that does not deal damage. When the base rune is invoked, the bearer gains the effects of the invocation as usual, but so do you, the runesmith, if possible. Nice and simple, and potentially extremely powerful. This scales really well when the more powerful runes, the ones that you want to etch for their full invocation, are on your allies. Perhaps you've got, say, the rune of Dragon Fury etched with this. Well, you invoke, and now both you and the ally fly 60 feet to either side of an enemy. Yeah, that could be really strong. The possibilities here are very strong depending on what you attach it to. And interestingly, this actually gets stronger the longer you have it because you're attaching it to better and better runes. The one challenge you have is the limit when you're tracing. But honestly, that's a small challenge. And as you level up, you can trace more things. This is absolutely one you want to trace. Still valuable to etch this, though, just not as strong. I'm going to give this A as well, but this edges on S to me. This is a really great rune. Just make sure that you've attached it to something you want to get value of as well, because it's just you and the bearer. Next up is Kit, Diacritic Rune of Mercy. You use this on a rune that deals damage and doesn't have the Void or Death traits to it. And when the base rune is invoked, it has the non lethal trait, but the bearer has a -1 status penalty to any saving throws related to the invoke effect. This does grant a slightly better chance that the bear is going to fail or crit fail against the damage, and there's some value in that. Sure, giving it the non-lethal trait though, sometimes you want to have that, but that's also rare. This can be a win if you want to knock out a creature and not kill it. That in itself is kind of rare. Also, you can actually knock it out with this damage. I don't know. So is it just the minus? Is that okay? Maybe. Is it is that -1 status penalty so strong that you're willing to spend an action to trace this mid combat? I I don't know. If you're giving a -1 to multiple creatures or some other effect that gives -1 to other things to multiple creatures, that's one thing. Just giving a -1 against the one base rune they have on them, that's going to be a damage only thing. I just don't think that's good enough. So I think this falls under C again, unfortunately. Next up, we have Per, Diacritic Rune of Continuum. This is on any rune. And when the base rune is invoked, you can trace it on another different creature within 15 feet of the rune bearer. And this is another one of those you can only have one at a time. After invoking it, you can't trace or etch it again for 10 minutes. This again has vast application. Yes, the second is just a trace, so it only lasts the one round, but there's nothing wrong with that. Doubling up on damage or control in combat, especially when one might be in melee, but the other is further away, and that can be a huge help, honestly. But I actually think that I like this better with runes that are etched onto allies with a strong universal effect, like some of what we see, especially in the level 9 rune options. Triggering a rune that provides, like healing just to have it trace itself onto another ally to trigger next turn to do more healing, yeah, that's going to feel worth it. I don't think it's going to work every time. For positive runes, if you have this attached, but there is no ally within range, you really can't invoke it because it would just be an absolute waste of the diacritic rune, and then you're going to lose it. Same thing if it's traced on an enemy, it does damage. Then if there's nobody within 15 feet, I mean, you don't have a choice. You're gonna have to trigger that rune anyway because you traced it. So I don't know. I think there's a chance this falls through for you, and it's more specific than it feels like on what's really gonna give you the most value, right? Like if you've got something that helps an ally with shield, you don't put it on there because you trigger this and nobody else has a shield, doesn't help. Because of that, I think it's good. I think it has value. I think it's a B though. I don't think it's got that kind of universal value or as strong as some of the A's we've seen so far. That brings us to Sun, Diacritic Rune of Preservation. This is, again, traced onto any rune. When the base rune is invoked, then the rune traces itself back onto the bearer. You can only have one instance of this, blah, 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 once per 10 minutes, right? Thankfully, this doesn't fall into that same trap that Per just fell into. If you invoke it, the target will be there because you just invoked it and they're still there, unless you kill them. That's about the only situation where this doesn't work. But you probably wouldn't have put this on them if they were about to die. Anyway, seems less likely that'll come up. So if you got a rune that's on an ally that you've etched on there and it's strong, triggering it for a strong outcome and then putting the passive back on to trigger again is probably worth a ton. Same thing though for enemies. You trigger damage against an enemy. Well, let's take Frost, right? You trace something on, it's going to expire, so you trigger it with the invoke because otherwise it just falls off anyway. It deals damage, then it traces itself right back on because you have this on there too. And now they're again affected by the base passive, which you want to have on them. Yeah, I think there's real strength in that. Because of that, because it works both ways, trace and etch, it's got a strong effect both times, and you're going to want it on just about anything you could possibly put it on. Sometimes it won't be worth necessarily putting on, but most of the time it will be. I'm going to give this an A. I can certainly see the argument that you could just, trace the thing on again after invoking, and you don't need to set it up in this way. But you won't be adjacent to your allies all that often necessarily. You might be, but you might not be. This just does it from whatever range as long as you can invoke from that range and you don't have to set it up again in any specific way. So I do think this is valuable. Yes, I can see that argument, but I just don't think it's a strong argument when this fits so many other situations where it wouldn't be easy to retrace. Next up is T, Diacritic Rune of Fundaments. This is on a rune that deals acid, cold, fire, or electricity damage, which are our four base damage types. When the base rune is invoked, you can change the type of damage it deals to one of the other four listed. Okay, so I suppose this means that you could grab just one of the damage runes for like from level 1, just have one, planning on taking this, and then if you need to change away from that, you could change it to either trigger weakness or avoid a resistance or immunity situation. But once you have two runes that deal different types of damage, this feels like, but why? Also, it just isn't providing the same kind of value that many of the others do, except for in very rare cases. where mainly the cases where you can trigger weakness. I don't know. I find this to be very underwhelming. Not useless. It has a purpose, but it's only going to have a purpose when you've got, a rune or two that do damage that doesn't do one of the types of damage that would trigger weakness, but they have a weakness to one of the other two damage types you don't have. And then you're spending two actions essentially to set up to trigger that weakness, which is fine, but it's very rare given the very narrow set of damage types we have. I think this is a C. It has a purpose. It's not useless. It's not a D, but it's not far off. And our last at level 5 is Diacritic Rune of Intensity. This is put on a rune that deals damage. When the base rune is invoked, it gains a status bonus to the damage equal to 2 plus half your level. This is just another way to flat out add damage. This is a better way to do it than our last rune does it. This is kind of the other side to our earlier rune. Rather than spread out our damage, we're going to go ahead and hit the rune bearer harder, right? And sometimes just dealing more damage to one is better than spreading it out. And that might be its best use case, right? The issue that we're going to have is adding enough damage to feel worth it. Let's take our fire rune at this level, right? So you're level 5, your fire rune is dealing 3d8 fire damage when it's invoked. That's an average of 13.5 on a fail. If you take the action to trace this on top, you're going to add 4 damage, which is 2 plus half your level rounded down, to that invoke. This is less than a third of the original damage, and you're adding it on top. Is it worth the extra action, or 2, if you're doing it from range, in order to deal 4 more damage? And then again on the fail save. And I think that's a fair question. If you instead had every enemy within 15 feet, yes, I know it also hits allies, and you're going to make them make a save and it hits even one more creature. Let's just say it hits 2 creatures. You've added another 13.5 on a fail rather than 4 by doing the other Diacritic rune that does AoE damage. I know then we're spreading it, and maybe you want to take out a single creature, but I just don't think this hits hard enough. I don't think it's terrible. I think if you want to deal damage, and as you level up, let's say you're level 10, this is now adding 7 damage on. And okay, I can certainly see it, especially with a melee runesmith where you're hitting and applying all at once, where you're just taking one action to add this on and then blowing it up, and you're just trying to take down that one enemy. So I give it a B because I think there's a reason that you might use it, but it's a very low B. And I don't know. I could certainly see arguments for a C on this one as well. And that brings us to level 13, where we start off with Ek, Diacritic Rune of Phantasma. This is on a rune that deals damage. And the effect is the damage dealt by the base rune is spirit, and each adjacent enemy takes 1d8 persistent spirit damage. At level 17, persistent spirit damage increases by 1d8. I had to read this one multiple times and interpret it, so please give me your thoughts here. First of all, any damage the base rune does, passive or invoked, should count and becomes spirit. That's fairly straightforward. And that's almost never resisted and sometimes triggers weaknesses. Spirit is a great damage type. As for the persistent spirit damage, it just says your enemies adjacent to the creature. When? When you trace it? When it's invoked? Any time between tracing and invoking? As I can't tell, I'm going to go with the most liberal interpretation and say as long as Ek is active, if an enemy at any point is adjacent to the bearer, that enemy takes the persistent spirit damage, which makes sense as to why they chose persistent damage rather than like a straight damage hit. Assuming all of that is true, is this any good? Well, again, spirit damage is a great type, but this isn't boosting the damage to the bearer necessarily, and I don't want to assume that you're going to trigger weakness or bypassing resistance just by choosing spirit damage when you'd probably choose a damage type rune that wouldn't have resisted anyway. So yeah, would you change it just for spirit damage though if you weren't getting any of that? Probably not, right? That just doesn't feel worth it on its own. Then is the persistent spirit damage worth it? Well, honestly, I'm pretty underwhelmed. You are level 13, dealing 1d8 spirit damage to maybe 1 or 2 creatures that become adjacent to this. At this level, that is nothing. That they'll just ignore it. It doesn't even matter if they save or not. When they're taking 4 damage out of their hundreds of hit points, it's not gonna cut it. Because of all that, I just can't see wanting to actually put this on runes regularly. If you're in an undead campaign, I think there's value to this. Kind of. Maybe that. And so I'll give it a C for that. Maybe you want that persistent damage sparking weakness, but it's very narrow, and I just don't think this is worth it. That brings us to INTH, Diacritic Rune of Corruption. Put this on any rune. The base rune gains the Unholy trait, as does any of its damage. If applied to a holy creature, that creature is enfeebled too, as long as it bears the rune, the base rune. When you invoke that base rune, then it also deals another 2d4 persistent fire damage, and level +2, this goes up by another 2d4. So this can be applied to any rune, and it feels like it can be used in two ways. You either trace it on a rune that you traced on an enemy and add damage and trigger weakness, or etch or trace it onto a weapon, boosting that rune to deal extra damage when it invokes, and of course, you know, possibly triggering weakness that way. Does having both use cases make it any good? That entirely depends on your campaign. How many campaigns have holy creatures that you're fighting? Like if you're in a campaign where you're fighting angels, this is straight up S tier and it's awesome and you're going to punish the righteous and I love it. In any other campaign, it's a C tier. It just adds a small amount of persistent fire damage and in the end I think that makes it a B because it you can still do the fire damage, but it's weak fire damage. At least it's on the invoke. And keep in mind that you do eventually get runes that can do AoE damage on their own. So if you're using and invoking a rune that does AoE damage, all the creatures that take the damage from the AoE from the invoke also take the fire damage, which is why I'm going to give this that little bit of a boost. But again, it's just a B. I don't think it's amazing. The fire damage isn't crazy. At least it's something though. It brings us to NESH, Diacritic Rune of Contingency. You define a trigger for the base rune, and when that trigger occurs, you can invoke the rune as a reaction. You can only have one instance, right? 10 minutes between, all that stuff. I love the level of planning and control that you have here. There are some really powerful invokes that are best used when the exact right conditions hit, but normally you have to wait until your turn in order to invoke them and hope conditions are still the same. This is a much better way to get the most out of some of those invokes, especially the etched runes themselves. But this is the issue. This really works best with etched runes. That's not to say that you couldn't trace a rune and then do this, but that seems far less likely to work. Because remember that this has to be triggered if you trace it by the end of your next turn, and it's unlikely the trigger will happen unless it's something very generic. I really feel like you want to use this on etched runes that are best in certain situations that is common enough, right? It won't happen all the time, but at some point every combat, you should expect the condition to come up. Because of those restrictions, I want to say it takes it down to a B because this is otherwise very, very strong because this is an A in my mind. And I went back and forth when writing this script down, and I think I've gone back to an A on this one. And I'm giving it to an A because action economy. You can invoke two at once, and this gives you a different way to invoke outside of your turn. And I love things that take good planning and reward strategic thinking, and this does all of that. So I'm going to give it the A. Maybe that's too much. And our final one is Sar, Diacritic Rune of Righteousness. This is on any rune. The base rune gains the holy trait, as does its damage. If applied to an unholy creature, that creature is enfeebled too while it bears the rune. On invoke, when the base rune is invoked, the target is also drained 1. This is the other side to INTH. This is more likely to come up on average because, something like 10 times more likely probably, it's against evil creatures. Well, unholy, but you know what I mean. They come up a lot in campaigns, in the average campaign. The drained means, let's be honest, more damage than 2d4. Even 2d4 persistent fire, when it's going off, does a little bit of damage, but you're probably hitting things, because remember, you're level 13 at least. Drained 1 is a lot of hit points to drop, plus there's a debuff side to it. You're affecting fort saves, right? And the Invoke affects everything that the AoE might hit if this is tied to an AoE rune, and you should, right? We already have one AoE rune at 9th level, that's a base rune, and then, of course, at level 17, if you get there, you have a base rune that does a massive AoE. Draining everything is actually really, really strong. Even if you drain just one unholy creature through this, it's going to feel probably worth the addition, but even better if you enfeeble them first and then drain it. Anyway, that doesn't make it the strongest, most valuable diacritic rune ever, but I think that because it's going to come up often enough being unholy, and because I think the effects are strong enough, I'm going to give this one an A, but it's just at the cusp. It's just above a B, and that's comparing it to the other the other level 13 diacritic runes, which I didn't think were the strongest batch. So yeah, level 13, some of them were a bit of a bust. Same with level 5, but we do have some really strong diacritic runes. We had plenty that landed in A. But what do you think? Am I crazy to hate on Ek? Is Sun the worst diacritic rune that could have ever been made? Let me know in the comments, and as always, adventure on.